The restaurant was filled with soft music and quiet conversations as people gathered for the dinner. The large table in the center was full of important faces, business partners, friends, colleagues. Margaret sat at the far end, her hands resting gently in her lap, eyes watching her daughter, Rachel, who stood confidently at the head of the table. Rachel was everything Margaret had worked so hard to help her become. Smart, successful, polished. She wore an expensive suit and spoke with ease as she introduced her team to the others, and this, Rachel paused for a moment, barely glancing in her mother's direction, is my mother. She's here visiting. Her voice was flat, almost distant, as if acknowledging Margaret was more of an obligation than a joy. Margaret offered a small smile, nodding politely at the others, though no one at the table seemed to care. They quickly shifted their attention back to Rachel, eager to continue their conversation. A few minutes later, one of the men at the table asked a casual question, trying to make polite conversation. So, Mrs. Bennet, what line of work are you in? Before Margaret could open her mouth, Rachel answered for her. Oh, she never really worked. She stayed home mostly. You know, she wouldn't really understand this business world. The words sliced through the air like a knife. The man nodded awkwardly, giving Margaret a polite smile before turning away, clearly uninterested. Margaret's throat tightened. She lowered her gaze to her plate, focusing on the untouched food. Her hands trembled slightly under the table. She had spent her whole life raising Rachel. Sacrificing. Working odd jobs to keep food on the table. Sewing clothes late into the night. Skipping meals so her daughter could have enough. She had built her daughter's future with her own tired hands, and now she was nothing but a shadow, introduced as if she were an unimportant piece of Rachel's story. Rachel continued talking, laughing with her colleagues, never noticing the pain sitting just a few feet away. Margaret stayed silent, her chest tight, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She would not cry here. Not in front of these people. The sting of her daughter's words sank deeper than any slap. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel on the surface. But it cut her deeper than any harsh scream ever could. She sat still, breathing carefully, holding herself together. Around her, the conversation continued. The laughter grew louder. The business talk filled the air. But for Margaret, everything sounded distant, like a fog had settled around her, and in that fog, something inside her shifted. It was small, quiet. But it was the beginning of something she didn't fully recognize yet. Not anger. Not yet, but something close. The soft light from the small lamp filled the tiny apartment as Margaret sat at the kitchen table, sewing another patch onto Rachel's school uniform. The needle moved carefully through the worn fabric. She had done this more times than she could count. In the next room, Rachel sat on the floor, books spread around her as she worked through her homework. Her small voice called out, "Mom, can you help me with this math problem?" Margaret smiled softly, setting the sewing aside and walking over. She knelt beside her daughter, pointing gently at the numbers. "Let's look at it together, sweetheart." Those were the nights that filled most of their years. Quiet, simple, full of effort and love. During the days, Margaret worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs. She cleaned houses in the mornings, worked at the diner in the afternoons, and picked up sewing work in the evenings. She rarely sat down, rarely rested. The bills had to be paid. The rent was always due. She remembered the nights when there wasn't enough food for both of them. She would serve Rachel a full plate and pretend she had already eaten. "I'm not very hungry tonight," she'd say, smiling while her stomach ached quietly. She skipped buying herself new clothes for years so Rachel could have what she needed for school: new shoes, warm jackets, books for her classes. The dreams Margaret once had, finishing college, opening a small shop, were carefully folded and tucked away, like old letters stored in a box. She told herself, as long as my daughter has more than I did, and Rachel did. She was smart, driven, and determined. Margaret cheered at every school performance, clapped proudly at every award ceremony. She sat in the audience during graduation, tears of pride streaming down her face. When Rachel got her first job offer, they celebrated with a small cake Margaret baked herself. She had never seen her daughter so full of hope, and every time Margaret felt tired or worn down, she repeated the same quiet promise to herself, as long as my daughter has more than I did. But now, sitting in the shadow of her daughter's success, dismissed like a stranger at the dinner table, she couldn't help but wonder if it had all been worth it. She had given up everything to build Rachel's future, and somewhere along the way, her daughter had forgotten who made it possible. Margaret sat quietly in her chair, feeling the bittersweet ache settle in her chest. She didn't regret loving her daughter. She never would. But for the first time, she questioned what it had cost her, and whether anyone had ever truly seen her sacrifices for what they were. The afternoon sun slipped through the tall office windows as Margaret quietly entered the building. Rachel had asked her to stop by and drop off some documents she forgot at home. It was nothing unusual, and Margaret was always happy to help. She walked through the bright lobby, holding the folder tightly in her hands. The receptionist smiled politely, pointing her toward Rachel's office. As she approached, she heard her daughter's voice coming from inside the conference room next door. Margaret paused just outside the slightly open door. Rachel's voice was sharp, confident, filled with the same authority she used at every business dinner. No, Rachel was saying, with a light laugh, you don't understand. My mother doesn't get involved in any of this. She's just a housewife. There was a pause, then more laughter from the people inside. Rachel continued, her voice lowering slightly but still clear. She never really had a real job. I mean, she raised me and worked here and there, but she's not business-minded. She wouldn't know how any of this works. The words slammed into Margaret's chest. She stood frozen, the folder trembling slightly in her hands. Her stomach twisted, and for a moment she thought she might lose her balance. She could hear another woman's voice respond with a chuckle. Well, not everyone's cut out for this world, I guess. Some people are better at staying in the background. Rachel laughed again. Exactly. She's sweet, but she just doesn't understand how things work now. The voices faded as they moved deeper into conversation, but Margaret heard enough. More than enough. She had sacrificed her youth, her health, her dreams so Rachel could have these meetings, these conversations, this success. Every sleepless night, every skipped meal, every extra shift, she had carried all of it, and now her daughter dismissed her like a simple fool who couldn't possibly grasp the world Rachel lived in. It wasn't just the words. It was who Rachel had become. The pride Margaret once held for her daughter now twisted painfully into something else. She no longer recognized the woman in that room. Quietly, Margaret stepped away from the door, her breath shaky but controlled. She didn't confront her. She didn't burst into tears or demand answers. She simply walked back to the elevator, clutching the folder tightly to her chest. The ride down was slow. The quiet hum of the elevator filled the small space as she stood there, numbed. By the time she reached the lobby, her legs felt heavy, but she forced herself to keep walking. The receptionist called after her, but Margaret barely heard. Outside, the cool air brushed against her face as she stood on the busy sidewalk, surrounded by strangers who didn't see her. Her mind spun with the echo of Rachel's voice. She's just a housewife. She wouldn't understand. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat tight, her heart heavy. The betrayal cut deeper than anything before, not because of the words, but because of the truth they revealed. Rachel hadn't simply forgotten her sacrifices. She had erased them, and Margaret, standing alone on that busy street, felt the crack inside her heart widen. But even in that moment of deep pain, something else quietly began to stir beneath the ache. Not anger yet, but something steady, something waiting. The house sat still. Day after day, Margaret wandered its quiet rooms, hearing only the sound of her own footsteps. The clock ticked softly in the living room. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. But no voices filled the air anymore. Rachel had stopped visiting not long after that day at the office. She no longer called just to check in. The brief, polite phone calls that once came every few weeks stopped altogether. Margaret tried reaching out at first. She left voicemails, texted simple messages, hope you're doing well. Just wanted to hear your voice. Miss you. But the replies became shorter. Colder, busy, mom. Can't talk right now. Hope you're okay. And then, nothing. The silence grew heavier with each passing week. Her birthday came on a rainy afternoon. She baked a small cake for herself, just like she always used to bake for Rachel when she was a child. She placed a single candle in the center, lit it, and whispered softly to herself, "Happy birthday." The silence in the room was thick. No one dared interrupt. Rachel tried to regain her footing, but the weight of the moment pinned her in place. She had always believed her mother was small, fragile, powerless. And now, for the first time, she saw how wrong she had been. Margaret stood slowly, gathering her papers. The transition will be smooth. We've already handled most of the details. You'll receive your new role description by end of day. Rachel opened her mouth again, desperate to say something, to fight, to defend herself, to bargain, but no words came. Margaret gave one final smile, her eyes calm but firm. Welcome to your new boss. And with that, she walked out of the room, leaving behind the daughter who never thought she would see her mother rise. Margaret didn't need to shout, her silence said everything. The phone lit up again, buzzing softly on the table beside Margaret's chair. Another message. Another call. Another missed attempt. The screen flashed with Rachel's name, again and again. Mom, please. Can we talk? I didn't mean what I said. I was wrong. I see that now. Please, just call me back. Margaret sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap. The phone buzzed once more, then fell silent again. For years, she had waited for these words. For Rachel to finally acknowledge the hurt, the betrayal, the way she had been treated like nothing more than a quiet shadow, and now, here they were, soft apologies, desperate messages, regret dripping from every word, but the strange thing was, she no longer needed to hear them. She read the messages, calm and steady, her heart no longer racing, her chest no longer tight. She simply scrolled through the words and then set the phone down without replying. Her silence was no longer out of fear. It was her choice. Outside, the morning sun was warm as she stepped into her small garden. The flowers she planted months ago had bloomed beautifully. She bent down, gently watering each one, humming softly to herself. The world around her was peaceful. The breeze carried the sweet scent of blossoms. Birds sang nearby, and the leaves swayed lightly in rhythm. She had created this peace. Her life was no longer filled with the tension of waiting for someone to love her properly, no longer tied to hoping for Rachel's approval or attention. Rachel's calls kept coming. Voicemails filled the inbox. Messages arrived at all hours of the day. You built something incredible, Mom. I should have seen it sooner. Please, let's meet. I miss you. But Margaret knew these words came now because the power had shifted. Now that Rachel could no longer control the narrative, she wanted to rewrite it, but Margaret had already written her own ending. She spent her days walking along the quiet trails behind her cottage, breathing in the fresh air. She sat on the porch in the evenings with a cup of tea, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold as the sun set. Her peace was louder than any words Rachel could offer. Margaret didn't hate her daughter. She didn't feel the burning anger that once filled her. What she felt now was something far stronger, freedom. The phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, read the newest message, and gently powered it off. The silence returned. Calm, soft, full, and in that silence, Margaret found something she had waited a lifetime to feel: wholeness. The soft morning light poured through the large windows of her office. Margaret sat at her desk, flipping through the pages of her company's latest report. The numbers were strong. The balance sheet was steady. Orders continued to grow. The business she built, quietly, patiently, was thriving. Her small staff moved through the office with quiet energy, chatting softly as they worked, laughing together as they handled orders and meetings. It was a kind place, a warm place, built not on power or fear, but on trust. Margaret closed the report and leaned back in her chair. For a long moment, she simply sat there, looking around at everything she had created. All those years ago, she had been told she was just emotional, that she wouldn't understand business, that she didn't belong in boardrooms or decision-making. She had believed that for so long. She thought her sensitivity made her weak. She thought her tears, her hopes, her deep love for her family were something to be ashamed of. But now, sitting in the space she had made with her own hands, she saw the truth clearly. Her emotion had never been her weakness. It was her strength. Her compassion had built a company where employees felt seen. Her patience had allowed her to grow slowly, steadily, without cutting corners or chasing empty power. Her love for detail, for people, for creating something beautiful, those things made her successful. Emotion didn't make her fragile. It made her human. She hadn't changed herself to win. She hadn't become cold or ruthless like others expected. She simply stopped hiding who she was. Margaret's eyes wandered to a framed photo on her desk, her first product sample, carefully stitched by hand, sitting beside a small bouquet of wildflowers. It was a quiet reminder of where she started, and of the woman who dreamed long before anyone believed in her. The world once tried to shrink her, to push her into the background, but she had grown anyway. Her heart swelled not with pride for revenge, but with quiet satisfaction that she had reclaimed her life. For years, they treated her like a burden. An old woman who didn't understand. Someone to be managed, ignored, or quietly pushed aside. But she was never the burden, she was the foundation. And as she looked around her peaceful office, hearing the soft laughter of her team, seeing the bright future ahead, she whispered softly to herself, I was never the burden. Her voice was steady, warm, full of strength, and this time, she believed it. The evening settled softly over the city, the sky outside her office window painted in shades of deep orange and purple. The hum of traffic below faded into the distance. As the world outside slowed for the night, inside her office, the lights were warm and gentle. Margaret moved slowly, setting the small table near the window. She laid one plate down. One fork. One knife. A cloth napkin folded neatly beside the plate. The meal wasn't extravagant, just a simple roasted chicken with vegetables, the kind of meal she used to cook for her family long ago. But tonight, it was for her. She lit a single candle in the center of the table. Its flame flickered softly, casting a glow across the room. There were no voices interrupting her thoughts. No dos remarks. No one rolling their eyes or cutting her off, just silence. Calm, she sat down, resting her hands gently on the table for a moment. The quiet felt different now. It wasn't heavy or cold. It was full. Full of her own presence, her own peace. She looked around the office, the shelves filled with designs, the walls holding photos of her team smiling at company events, the windows overlooking a city she once thought belonged only to others. This was hers. Every inch of it. For years, she had been told she was too soft, too emotional, too simple to understand the world her daughter lived in. They had tried to make her small, to tuck her into a corner and forget her, but here she sat, not because she had fought them with anger or noise, but because she had quietly built her own world. Margaret reached for the glass of wine beside her plate, lifting it gently. She paused for a moment, breathing deeply, letting the fullness of the moment settle inside her. The weight she once carried had long since fallen away. She no longer longed for their approval, no longer hoped for an invitation into a life that never had room for her. Now, she had chosen her own seat at her own table, alone, yes, but not lonely. She smiled softly to herself, whispering the words that carried all the power she had once thought she lost. This time, I ate at my table. Alone, and free. The candle flickered as the words hung gently in the air, and Margaret knew, deep in her bones, that this time, it was enough, more than enough. The flame flickered gently in the still room. No calls came. No messages. No visitors. She sat at the table alone, staring at the small cake as the candle burned down. The quiet wrapped around her like a heavy blanket. Later that evening, she scrolled through her phone and saw pictures Rachel had posted online. Smiling photos from a company gala. Rachel stood beside business leaders, friends, all beaming for the camera, celebrating another big year. The caption read, the comments were full of praise. You've come so far. Your parents must be so proud. You've built everything on your own. Margaret's chest tightened at that last one. No mention of her. No trace of the years she poured into Rachel's life. The photos made it look as though Rachel had climbed the ladder alone, with no one behind her holding the base steady. The house grew darker as night fell. Margaret sat by the window, staring out at the empty street, the distant glow of porch lights flickering softly. There were no friends dropping by anymore. Family members, once eager to chat, had drifted away too. They followed Rachel's lead, believing the unspoken story that Margaret was old, difficult, or simply unimportant now. The house that once held laughter, busy mornings, and long talks now stood hollow. She had spent a lifetime giving her love, her time, her dreams. And now, in return, she had silence. Margaret stared at the empty chair across from her, hearing only the distant sound of wind outside. The woman who gave everything now sat with nothing but her own company, but even in the quiet, deep beneath the loneliness, something remained. A small ember. It flickered gently, refusing to go out. They had taken her place in their lives, but they hadn't taken everything, not yet. The morning light poured gently through the kitchen window as Margaret stood before the stack of old boxes she had pulled down from the attic. The air smelled of dust and old memories. She hadn't touched these boxes in years. At first, she was just looking for something to do. Anything to fill the silence. But as she opened one of the boxes, her hands brushed across something unexpected. It was a simple folder, worn and faded. She opened it carefully. Inside was a certificate, her name printed clearly across the top, Margaret Bennett, completion of small business and entrepreneurship course. The memory came rushing back. Years ago, before Rachel was born, she had enrolled in night classes. Back then, she dreamed of opening a small sewing shop. She wanted to make custom dresses, mend clothes, maybe even teach others, but life had other plans. When Rachel came along, Margaret put the dream away. She took whatever job she could find to support her daughter. She had always told herself, there will be time later, but later never came. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still strong. As she dug further into the box, she found an old journal. The leather cover cracked softly as she opened it. Inside were pages filled with notes, ideas, sketches of shop layouts, lists of supplies, even a few rough business plans she had written late at night after Rachel went to sleep. She read through the pages slowly, tears welling in her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from something else. The dreams weren't completely gone. They had only been sleeping. That afternoon, she decided to go for a walk, needing the fresh air. As she strolled through the neighborhood, she ran into Linda, her old neighbor from years back. Margaret, Linda said warmly. It's been ages. They sat on a bench beneath a large oak tree, catching up. Margaret hesitated before mentioning what she found. I came across my old business course certificate and some notes I wrote. It feels strange seeing them again. Linda smiled gently. You always had good ideas, Margaret. You were always creative, even when life didn't give you the chance. Her voice was calm, but the words settled deep into Margaret's heart. You think it's too late? Margaret asked softly. Linda shook her head. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be. The breeze brushed gently through the trees as Margaret sat quietly, letting the thought take root. For the first time in years, she felt awake. The sadness, the loneliness, they were still there, but they didn't feel as heavy. Something inside her was stirring again, not because of anyone else. Not for Rachel, for herself. The days no longer felt so heavy. Margaret moved with quiet purpose now. She didn't speak of her plans to anyone, not that anyone was calling or visiting to ask. This was hers. Hers alone. She sat at the small kitchen table every evening, her reading glasses perched on her nose, scrolling through online courses and tutorials. The glow of the laptop screen lit up her determined face late into the night. The old business certificate wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a starting point. She enrolled in updated business courses, learning about online sales, marketing, accounting, all the things she had once believed were beyond her reach. During the day, she tested sewing patterns again, her fingers slowly remembering the work they used to do. She experimented with fabric, colors, and styles. She designed simple yet elegant clothing, pieces that reminded her of what she once dreamed of. Soon, she launched a small online store. Quietly. No announcements, no fanfare. Just a simple website she built late one night, offering her handmade designs. Orders trickled in at first. A few here and there. Each one brought a small burst of excitement. She packaged every order herself, adding a handwritten note in each box. Thank you for supporting my small business. Slowly, the store gained attention. Customers left kind reviews. Word spread. Margaret's quiet little business grew. With each sale, she reinvested. Bought better materials. Upgraded her equipment. Improved her designs. She formed an LLC. It was official now. Her company.as orders increased. She knew she couldn't do it all alone anymore. She posted a few quiet job listings, looking for help. One afternoon, she reviewed an application that caught her eye. The name was familiar, Anna, one of Rachel's former colleagues. They had once worked closely at Rachel's firm before Anna left, unhappy with how she had been treated there. During the interview, Anna spoke respectfully, unaware at first of Margaret's connection to Rachel.as. They talked. Anna mentioned softly, I've heard your daughter's name before. I used to work at her firm. Margaret smiled gently but offered no details. I believe we've taken different paths, she said calmly. But you're more than welcome here if you're ready for something new. Anna smiled back, her eyes bright. Absolutely. The business continued to grow, quietly, steadily. Margaret managed her staff with grace, creating a small team who respected her not because of who her daughter was, but because of who she was. She didn't brag. She didn't post about it. She didn't seek attention. She simply built brick by brick while Rachel carried on, still believing her mother sat idle and forgotten. Margaret had built something real, something that was fully hers, and she did it all without raising her voice. The office building stood tall and sleek, its glass windows reflecting the bright afternoon sun. Margaret walked through the revolving doors, calm and poised, as if she had walked these halls for years. Her business had grown far beyond anything she once imagined. What started as a small online store had blossomed into a full company. New designs, steady clients, and growing demand led to a beautiful office space, a skilled team, and strong partnerships. And now, the moment had come. Rachel's startup, once praised, once untouchable, had been struggling quietly for months. Overexpansion, poor management, and careless decisions had drained its resources. Investors lost confidence. The business, once Rachel's pride, was on the brink. Margaret's company, on the other hand, was strong, profitable, respected, and, with careful planning, she had positioned herself to acquire what remained of Rachel's failing company. The merger papers had been signed. The deal was done, and now, all that remained was the first meeting with the newly absorbed staff. Margaret sat at the head of the long glass table, her posture steady, her expression calm. Her team sat beside her, prepared and professional. The door opened, and Rachel stepped inside, her face tight with forced confidence. She hadn't yet seen the full list of the company's new leadership. She expected some faceless executive, some distant investor, but when her eyes landed on Margaret, her entire body froze, her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The color drained from her face. Margaret simply smiled, her voice soft and clear. Welcome. I'm pleased you could join us. Rachel swallowed hard. Mom, Margaret held up her hand gently. Here, you can call me Ms. Bennett. The staff around the table stayed silent, sensing the weight of the moment. Rachel's eyes darted from face to face, searching for something to grab onto, some sense of control, but there was none. Her mother, the woman she had dismissed, mocked, and abandoned, now sat in the seat of power she once held. Rachel's voice trembled slightly. You own the company? Margaret's smile remained calm, steady. That's correct. She folded her hands neatly on the table. You see, while you were busy building your world, I was quietly building mine. Rachel's shoulders stiffened. How? Margaret's voice stayed even, never rising. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to explain. I simply worked. I simply waited.